Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 89, Film de Femmes, Deux, Agnes Varda.
Yep, say that again for us. Pronounce that in super French.
Film de Femmes, Deux, Agnes Varda.
French, the language that only pronounces half of the letters that are there. You gotta love them. That's not a knock on France. When I knock on France, you'll know. But
no, but we're talking lots of France today because
certainly.
Agnes Varda is French, and her films revolve heavily, are heavily centered in France. She spent some time in L.A., but let's get the full rundown on who Agnes Varda is. Although we have seen her a little bit way back in season 1 when we did our world tour. And we covered the French New Wave because Agnes Varda was a huge component of the French New Wave, specifically her first film, Cleo from 5 to 7, which we covered. And now we're going to take a little bit of a broader look at her career from her narrative works through to what she focused on very heavily in the later part of her career, which was documentary films.
Correct. In fact, our story doesn't even begin in France. Our story begins in Belgium, where Agnes Varda was born in 1928 in Brussels. At the ripe old age of 18, as soon as she was legally able, she changed her name from Arlette Varda to Agnes Varda. She began attending college in Paris, where she sought a degree in literature and psychology. But that's not really where she ended up. Although you could argue that film is very closely related to both of those fields of study. She started off as a still photographer out of school and gradually became interested in film, although she had never really studied it. And she claimed that by the age of 25, she had only seen about 20 films, which, even if you're not a big film fan, seems hard. That seems very hard to achieve. I mean, most people see probably at least a couple new movies every year, at least, even if you're not that into it. So that's very surprising. Anyway, she decided she wanted to make a short film, so she wrote a script, got some friends, and shot it. That movie was La Pentecôte from 1954. And technically, her career kind of starts before the French New Wave, so some of her earliest work comes out before folks like Godard and all those other French people whose names suddenly escape me stopped writing reviews in Cahiers du Cinéma and started actually making movies, which happened closer to the 60s. But Agnes Varda was still part of it, and she became kind of like the chief voice of what's known as the left bank of the French New Wave, which we've already talked about, which tend to focus a little bit more on theme than aggressive cutting styles like the right bank did. The right bank being Truffaut and Godard mostly, and then a bunch of other French people thrown in there. And she's always kind of had a bent towards documentary. All of her, the whole French New Wave movement is kind of based in a certain realism that kind of, is closely tied to the idea of documentary. And it's kind of always popped up in her career here and there. And then eventually, towards the end of her career, and the end of her life, they kind of go hand in hand. She just made a lot of documentaries, some self-reflexive, some about other people in her life. She made a couple documentaries about Jacques Demy, her husband, who was actually another member of the French New Wave, and another wonderful French filmmaker. I love his musical trilogy. Highly recommend it. And yes, that is correct. Unfortunately, she did just pass away earlier this year, actually, on March 29th, which is very, very sad. But it does... It's a sad note in this year in terms of the filmmaking community, but it is a good time to reflect on her career in some and what makes her so special as a filmmaker.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, in order to kind of go through her career, obviously there are a lot of finer points that we'll be kind of skipping over, but the films that we have picked out for today are Le Bonheur, something like that.
Bonheur.
From 1965, which won the Silver Bear at the Berlin International Film Festival and was nominated for the Golden Bear. I don't know exactly how those distinctions work. And
you don't know your bear, Jonathan?
I don't know the Bears. I'm so sorry. And then we'll be moving on to a documentary, The Gleaners and I, from 2000, which won Best Documentary at lots of film festivals. A lot of her films were more film festival fodder, if you will, rather than like Oscar type films. So they have lots of I don't want to say minor awards, but normally we just put Oscars on here, and her films were very well recognized, but just not necessarily in the U.S. Academy Awards.
Yeah. Even the artsy movies that tend to win the Oscars tend to be fairly mainstream and promoted as such.
Right.
And Agnes Varda, either through not being interested in, or the mainstream not super being interested, or having the market space for her and her films, she just didn't end up there a whole lot. So a lot of her accolades come from definitely like the cinemaphiles of the world, and the film festival heads of the world. Definitely the more artsy bent of the film world, but that doesn't negate the quality of them at all.
Right. But the final film that we'll be talking about, Faces Places from 2017, was actually nominated for Best Documentary at the Academy Awards. By that time, obviously very late in her life, she had gotten a lot of recognition, and it's very fun. It's pretty easily marketed towards the mainstream, which we'll talk about, I'm sure. But it also won the Golden Eye at Cannes and the People's Choice Award at the Toronto International Film Festival. So again, very well recognized, kind of in very various spheres of cinema celebrations.
All right, Jonathan. So without further ado, let's get into what makes Agnes Varda such a special filmmaker. And let's bring you guys, who might not be overly familiar with a lot of her works, closer to a wonderful filmmaker, many of whose films are available on the Criterion Channel. Again, not a sponsor, which they were, maybe one day. But anyway, let's talk about Bonheur from 1965. Jason, what is that one all about?
Bonheur from 1965. Awash in bright colors and cheery music, Bonheur is the story of a man with a happy family and a happy life, with a wonderful wife who he loves and adores. This same man meets and secretly begins an affair with a beautiful woman who works at the French Postal Service. To him, it feels just like more happiness, and he sets out to bring the two halves of his happy life into alignment, with dire consequences in store.
All right, Jonathan. So this is a very interesting movie, and I watched it, and I had a very strong reaction to it, and I was worried that I wasn't having the intended reaction to the movie, which doesn't mean that if you don't have the intended reaction to a movie, you're doing it wrong, or somebody's doing it wrong. Obviously, the audience is a big part of the interpretation, but I hopped on Letterboxd, and I was quickly reassured that I was having the correct reaction to this movie, and that was indeed what was intended, because Agnes Varda is very, very, very good at making movies. And the weird, thematic dissonance in this movie between all of the bright, shiny colors and, this really kind of, dark, narcissistic, selfish character at the center of it is brilliant and disturbs you to the core of your being. I felt gross after I watched this movie.
Yeah, no, same. And I did the same thing. It took me, because right when you finish the film, you're like, that was terrible. We followed this really terrible guy, and he was, oblivious, and he never got kind of his just desserts or whatever. And then as you start to think of it, you're like, okay, so if we think of this as an ironic satire, then it becomes brilliant, because like you were saying, that dissonance throughout the whole film is a biting criticism of, like you said, that narcissism that I think is prevalent in a lot of areas of. I think it can be kind of extrapolated to a lot of areas of modern society rather than strictly in an adultery type sense. But it's just this sense of feeling that you deserve everything and, there's no repercussions to anything, and being completely oblivious to the fall off of those kinds of narcissistic decisions. That is just, it makes you feel really weird when you're watching it, especially when you're watching it presented in like this really bright and colorful and upbeat
so bright,
film.
so colorful.
Everything about the way that the film is presented makes you think like, okay, we're on the side of this guy, but really you're just kind of like in his head, which is completely upside down. And yeah, it's a trip, but it's one that it grew on me as I took a step back from it after the movie was over and realized like what was actually being, what the end goal was supposed to be. And I was like, okay, so I'm supposed to feel this way about this guy. And everything else is supposed to kind of, put this kind of reflexive turn on it. Like this is not just an isolated thing for this character, No.
There's a lot of people who exist like this, who think that happiness is getting exactly what you want all the time. And this movie takes that idea and then smashes it into a million little pieces.
Yeah. And then carries on with its
really
day.
Brilliantly. And then just carries on. Because it just, the happiness that we do have to, just the ability to put together the idea of happiness in a film that is so like effervescent and all present and just like it flows off the screen into your brain through the use of color and music and the soft kind of slightly diffused light used throughout the movie, and everything's soft and comfortable, and there's bright blues and greens and yellows everywhere, and it's so clearly like this presented as like this perfect blissful happiness that is kind of like fundamentally impossible for that long of a stretch of time, or like to so fully like exist in one person's life. It's just really well put together, just that fact. But then to use that as a way to contradict the selfish want for that in one person is just really, really smart. Every time I come back to this film, I think it's better than the last time.
Yeah.
It's just really, really well put together. It's kind of got like this wonderful dreamlike feel to it. Like you feel like you're just floating through the entire movie. And
she pulls references from like classic paintings and stuff that are actually inspired by this lake and these locations that she's actually using around France. So kind of even the visual history of the cinematography and stuff like has this, it already has a very happy connotation to it, even if you're just picking up on that subconsciously.
Yeah. And then things like it does have a very loose plot structure. It's not really driven. There's maybe one cause and effect in the entire movie.
Which is the most glossed over point in the whole thing.
Yeah. But it's done. I think it's done that way on purpose. It feels something will happen and it'll take you like one or two scenes for it to really sink in what just happened, for you to realize, oh, that guy is cheating on his wife. It'll take you two or three scenes after that actually takes place for that to sink in. But that's the point, is that it's presented as this happiness, but without the cinematic rhetoric being used to add that punch immediately when it happens. It forces you as an audience member to think about it in contrast to this man's want. His like big want, which is to just have everything, and have everybody be okay with it at the same time.
And the other thing that makes this film interesting is that this is, on its face, this is a fairly tired premise. The idea of this guy who is cheating on his wife or whatever, he's looking for something else, something more, a different kind of love or something like that. I even think back to Oh shoot, I can't remember the title of it. What's that early David Lean movie? Brief Encounter.
Oh,
Yeah.
Brief Encounter. Yes.
That movie has pretty much the same premise, but the whole like driving thematic element is that these two people are struggling with this, and they're like, should we be doing this? Should we not be doing this? The thing that makes this movie interesting is that he has no struggles with this at all. He is so like excited about it and happy about it, and has no even like concept that this might not be a good thing. And then he just kind of lays it all out there for his wife, and he's like, isn't this great that I'm so happy? And he sounds like insane when he's saying it to her, and he takes like this this good
he
5
sounds like a
minute
total
monologue.
sociopath. Yeah. He is scary in that moment where he's talking like a sociopath.
And he's got this whole like metaphor for his life and his happiness worked out and everything, and his wife is just sitting there, and you can see that her soul is just being crushed with every word that comes out of his mouth. But she just kind of like smiles and nods, because he's the most blind person to himself. But I think Agnes Varda is showing us that to say, like, don't be blind to your own self. Don't be blind to the ways that you're trying to please yourself that are really hurting all the people around you. Because true happiness requires sacrifice, and he wasn't willing to sacrifice anything, or just had no concept of sacrifice at all.
Yeah. And I love the way the argument is presented, because it's rather bold, because typically every single,
that's what makes it feel weird.
Yeah. Every single piece of cinematic rhetoric in a movie is typically going towards straight towards making a point. Mm-hmm. But this movie essentially pulls like the cinematic rhetoric equivalent of reverse psychology on you. And it's really, really tricky, but it's really, really effective, and it gets you real good.
It's almost like Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, to like an extent, like in that vein of satire, where he's making this argument with a straight face that is a terrible, terrible idea. And the author's purpose is to subvert the premise that is being made and defended in a very strong manner. Yeah, no, it's a very good. Actually, yeah, you're right. This is a very good example of satire. Maybe one of the purest examples of satire in a movie that I've ever seen. And what's more, it's definitely something that you would not see in the mainstream. Right.
Like you would definitely not see this in a Hollywood movie. You might see something close to it. You might see a satire in a modern Hollywood movie, or even a 60s Hollywood movie, but you're not going to see it executed this boldly. This is something you can only do kind of by existing outside of the mainstream a little bit. Yeah. And credit where credit's due, Agnes Varda takes full advantage of her position, whether or not it's one that she at various points in her career decidedly wanted to exist in outside of the mainstream, or was kind of forced into existing outside of the mainstream. But this project she tends to have a penchant for seem to be those that are favored in the world of indie cinema. And this is a very good example of that.
And I think another thing that probably makes this, like, if she was doing this within kind of a mainstream framework, one of the things that would probably have to change would be the ending. It would have to have some kind of a bittersweet ending. Something would have to happen to the guy. But I think that the ending is actually incredibly brilliant. And I'm going to try not to get like into too much spoilers or anything. But after the climax of the film, the irony of the whole thing is that he ends up where he started. And he doesn't even realize it, that he could have been just as happy the whole time had he not gone through this whole thing, because literally the one woman is replaced by the other one doing the exact same function in his life. And there's no difference except that he has caused this huge destruction that he never brings it up after it happens. It never comes up in the last 15 minutes of the film, or however long it takes for the denouement.
He takes like 5 minutes of screen time before the climax, and when he's like with his mistress permanently. One, that makes him even more it makes him look like even more of a sociopath. And two, yeah, you're right. It is a bold. You wouldn't have that ending in a mainstream movie. In a mainstream movie, he would realize he had done wrong, and he would have changed fundamentally as a person. But in this one, he stays the exact same crazy human being that he was at the beginning. And here's a question, Jonathan.
Okay.
Because I think the answer to this is yes. Do you think he's gonna do it again? Because I think he's gonna do it again.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason for him not to, and there's no reason for him, as long as his little premise doesn't get refuted in some way, or at least as long as he doesn't come to terms with it, there's no reason for it not to go like even farther than that. He could extend that metaphor of like anything that adds to his happiness just makes more happiness in the world. He could take that to Hitler-sized lengths, if he wanted to.
Yeah, anything that makes me happy makes the world better,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Right? Also, what do you make of the fact that the wife and the mistress look incredibly similar?
Oh my gosh, that's the other thing, is that, there's there's no difference. Again, at the end, he's exactly where he started with. He's with a woman who looks exactly the same as his wife and is doing the exact same thing in his life, and he doesn't understand that he could have just had that the whole time.
Yeah, if you cut together a wide shot from the opening scene and a wide shot from the closing scene, you would not be able to tell that they were different women.
I legitimately got confused, like in the middle of the film, like between who he was with sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's the point.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
I don't think there was a real difference in his mind.
Yeah.
I think it was all just the same. They all ran together. Like all of the women on the cabinet in the workshop, they all just ran together.
Yeah. So the question that I have is kind of, how do we classify this guy? Let's try and get a name going here. Francois.
Is his name like Jacques or Francois?
Yeah, Francois.
I was just pulling random French names out of my butt.
So how do we classify Francois in kind of the classical protagonist categories? Because I wouldn't really call him an anti-hero or even like a tragic hero. Like, he's almost like that climactic dialogue that he has with his wife, where he lays out his whole philosophy of life, is almost pulled straight out of like the antagonist side of any other kind of a film. Like, that's what the bad guy would be saying, that the good guy has to.
He's the villain. He's the villain of the movie.
But he's also the protagonist, because we follow him throughout the whole thing.
This is true. I don't think he's even an anti-hero.
I know.
I think so if you had built this movie up with that mainstream ending we were talking about, where he
something bad happens to him,
where the bad thing happens at the climax,
or at least he realizes and feels
bad. And feels bad, then overcomes his hubris, but also falls victim to it, then he'd be a tragic hero.
Yeah.
So really, it's a subversion of the tragic hero in order to create a villain, but one who's just so. Okay, so here's the thing. Our traditional ideas of heroes are typically built around what you might consider your standard mentally functioning human being. Not to say like that mental illness or mental health problems put you outside of that, but mostly to say that somebody who understands the concepts of society and interaction and the concepts of good and evil typically functions as your protagonist. Somebody who's a sociopath or a psychopath typically does not. And I feel like he falls into the sociopathic category because he doesn't understand that everything's so centered on him, and he doesn't understand the world outside of him very well.
And I was going to say that
fake it,
Varda,
but I don't think he's making it.
Yeah, I was going to say that Varda might not have been thinking in those categories, but as a psych major, it's actually plausible that she could have been thinking in those exact categories.
Oh yeah, it's very, very plausible that this sociopath who goes around treating people as if they were just like disposable and interchangeable.
Yeah.
you know, yeah.
And
it's interesting to shine a light on essentially like a form of everyday sociopathism that exists within society and is probably pretty common. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people like this who, I mean, a lot of them are probably cheaters. A lot of them probably do other things, but this same kind of selfish form, selfish outlook and selfish happiness that exists probably more than you would like to think about it.
Yeah, and I think that's the point of the film, is not to just say, like, where are these people in the world, but to say, where am I this guy? Where am I so concerned with maximizing my happiness that I am, you know, being harmful or destructive to the other people around me in one way or another?
Yeah, because outside of this, he's kind of a normal dude.
Yeah, and we build sympathy for him at the beginning. Like, a lot of sympathy, because he's got a beautiful wife, he's got great kids, they're on this picnic, everything is like so picturesque and pristine. You're like, man, I wish I had his life or whatever. And then you're like,
the visual is definitely of like a normal person. Like this guy could be your neighbor or your coworker, and you could be like, oh, he's a nice guy, he's got such a nice family.
And even more than that,
it's
idyllic.
About that tragedy that happened. Yeah. I think it's almost like a blown up example of that thing where somebody's like, oh, so and so, oh yeah, they're a nice guy,
right.
And then you get to know them, and you're like, oh, you're crazy. You might seem nice, but you've got some messed up stuff in your head, man.
Yeah. And the last thing about the last thing about kind of the ways that we think about protagonists in film is there's generally two kinds of protagonists. There's the one that is changed over the course of the film, and then there's the one that if he doesn't change, he probably changes something in the world around him in that universe. And I think he definitely falls into the latter category, which is what makes him so dangerous, because you know, if we're trying to kind of apply this to life, like, these are people who are not in a process of change at all, but they change the things that are around them. And for the worse, obviously, as we see throughout the film. So that's the other kind of category that you think of protagonists in. And this is one that's like, it's mostly a warning, I guess.
Yeah. He tries to bend the world to his happiness, and that which does not bend breaks. I.e. the wife. But anyway, he's like a weirder version of like a Bluebeard, in my opinion. But
I guess we got to talk too about, especially with this film, because this is our only narrative film that we're talking about this week for Agnes Varda, and this has a lot of those French New Wave influences in it on a technical level. And I was really amazed by some of the different editing techniques and cinematography techniques. There's a thing she does several times where instead of cutting between like shot and reaction shot during dialogue scenes, she'll just literally pan the camera every time, kind of play ping pong with in the conversation. And there's even one where she pans across a tree between each one, and the focus racks from the character to the tree to the other character as the camera pans to each one. And there's little things that, you know, kind of stand out, but they have that quirky charm that all of the French New Wave editing techniques had. Every time I watch one, I'm like, wow, that's so creative. And you see how that kind of you know, came into things like the American New Wave, and you can see some of that stuff, but this stuff had like never been done before, especially in the mainstream, where it's like, okay, we've got film, we know how it's done, we're just going to work on perfecting these techniques that have been done for years and years. And these French indie directors were just like, well, what if we did this instead? I mean, why is that wrong? And you see those little like experimentations, not even in experimental films, but even in these you know, fairly traditional narratives. And they're just putting in these really creative things, like also the montage of shots when he's with his mistress, and you're just seeing like different parts of their bodies basically kind of combined in these different compositions and montaged together, which was a really creative way to show that, look, he's having an affair. Like, officially, there's no question about this now.
Yep. No, not even emotional affair, full on affair. but without like a gratuitous sex scene.
Right.
Like it's essentially a very artful way to say they're banging.
Right. So yeah, Agnes Varda brings a lot of those really creative techniques to this movie and to her documentaries as well, which we'll talk about.
Oh, right. On to The Gleaners and I from 2000, which is pretty meta and very much a documentary, and almost all of Agnes Varda's documentaries are meta. But before we get into that, Jason, what are the details on The Gleaners and I?
The Gleaners and I from year 2000. Agnes Varda presents the storied history and modern existence of gleaners, or the people who traditionally pick up what's left over after a crop has been harvested, keeping the food for themselves and saving the farmer the work of picking the leftovers up. She speaks with modern gleaners, both those who scour the fields and those who pick through the leftovers and tossaways at the city. She explores the economic and ecological impact of gleaning. She also scores museums and old stores of art for historical images of gleaners. But probably most importantly, she draws a connection between herself as a storyteller and filmmaker and gleaners, displaying her gleaning habits as she travels around France, picking up pieces of gleaners' stories here and there, assembling them all into The Gleaners and I.
All right, Alex, we're back in documentary realm. We haven't done like a lot. We did a documentary episode, and then we just covered They Shall Not Grow Old in our last episode by Peter Jackson. And Agnes, like as far as documentary style, Agnes Varda is almost the complete opposite of what we were talking about as far as Peter Jackson's style with They Shall Not Grow Old, in that his is almost entirely objective, almost as objective as you can get in documentary, which is never completely possible. But the fact that Peter Jackson completely removes himself from the film until he puts his little personal note at the very, very end, and lets all of the storytelling be done from the mouths of the soldiers in the actual environment, and keeping all of the footage and images to those that were produced at the actual time, makes it incredibly objective. Agnes Varda doesn't do that. All of her documentaries are so subjective, and whatever, like, especially in this one, because the topic is technically completely unrelated for her. I mean, she puts "and I" in the title, which kind of incorporates herself into it. But she could have made a documentary that was like, this is what gleaning was like before. This is how gleaning kind of relates to homeless people who don't have very much, and the ways that they're able to still survive off of basically the waste of society and stuff like that. But she takes it to the next level and brings it to herself and to her life, and puts herself into the lives of the subjects by just engaging with them and being part of them and following them, and actually like being interested in who they are, rather than standing back doing the fly on the wall thing that became very popular in the 60s and 70s. When, again, like we talked about in the documentary episode, at some point in documentary history, cameras became very light and portable, and people were able to do documentary filmmaking that was very detached from the subjects and just kind of let events play out in front of them. And even though Varda uses that and even calls that out in this film, because she has her little camcorder that she carries around and she's doing a lot of the filming herself, she's still putting herself in there and affecting the way that the subjects are interacting with the world, but in a very intentional way. And Varda's charm is what makes that work.
Yeah, certainly. And you can tell, like, she uses mostly like a handheld camcorder.
Yeah.
Whenever she's shooting most of this.
It looks like picture. A home movie.
Yeah, it definitely does. Which is okay for the year 2000 film circuit, film festival circuit, in which it did very, very well. And you're right, it does have like these interesting multiple layers of story going on. There's one which is the historical context for gleaning, which I think Jason just explained it, but just in case he didn't, or you're a little confused, it's essentially after the harvest was finished, there'd be a bunch of wheat or tomatoes or potatoes or whatever else people grow on farms left out in the field. And it would cost the farmers quite a bit to go back out and pick that stuff up that was left over. And it was pretty expensive to hire people to do that. So instead, you still need your fields clear. You just make it legal for other people to come in and pick it up, and they can keep it, the extra potato or whatever. It's a good way to feed people, or poor families or sharecroppers who couldn't otherwise feed themselves. Probably the same people who actually worked on the crops in the first place. But that's one storyline, is exploring that. And obviously, there's the legal context for it. Agnes Varda goes and talks to lawyers and judges and I think a professor about the context for gleaning historically and the legal basis for it. She also explores it through art and history. A famous picture of a gleaner that she mimics, and that's probably the most famous picture associated with this movie, is Agnes Varda holding that bundle of wheat. Then there's the other storyline, which blends into it, which you mentioned, Jonathan, which is the idea of modern day gleaning, both urban and rural, and people on the poor end of the economy being able to glean in order to feed themselves, whether that be hobos picking food out of the trash, or people literally still gleaning crops out of a field or a farm or a greenhouse, and the legality of it and the situation in modern French law, as well as like the economic benefit of like trying to avoid as much food waste as possible. And then there's my favorite part of this movie, which is the storyline, the meta storyline, which is the idea of gleaning as a storyteller, which is very much what Agnes Varda does, and what all filmmakers do to a certain extent, is pick up things here and there. And it's something we've talked about before on the podcast, not only blending events that you see in the real world or see in your life, but blending like this bit from that story here or this shot from that movie there, and mixing them all together to be able to feed your own film and to bring it into creation through pieces that you pick up here and there. And you can tell over the course of this movie that that's something that Agnes Varda has actually built up into like a reflex. Like she just automatically does it and can't stop. And I think that's something that all filmmakers and storytellers, that's a point that they all get to, where they can't stop picking up on those small stories. They are like compulsive gleaners.
And we talk about that a lot with directors, and especially very theme-heavy directors. Like, again, we always come back to these two, but it's because we love them so much. Wes Anderson and Christopher Nolan, like they have these through lines that they basically glean from themselves, and they just kind of mix and match them with other types of situations and stuff like that. But yeah, I think that Varda does a really good job of creating this incredibly multi-layered film that has, first of all, the topic that she sets out with as far as gleaning is so it's just so metaphoric, I guess, already. Like there's so much you can do with it. And I think that this film is also a really good example of the ways that documentaries are basically written in the edit. So you kind of start out with an idea of a topic, but then you kind of let that take you wherever it is. And obviously there are different kinds of documentaries that are more or less structured, but this film feels so fluid. It feels like she had this idea. She's like, I'm very interested in this idea of gleaning and the evolution of gleaning. And so she goes to museums, she starts with the history, and then she's like, okay, so where do I see that in the world today? And then she goes to those places. She goes to modern day farms. And it's so interesting to see modern day people actually going to the places where potatoes are dumped, and they're picking up all the potatoes that weren't marketable for the supermarkets and stuff like that are still perfectly good. And then they do that every week, and they, feed their families with that food. And then while she's there, she meets this guy, and oh, he's interesting. We weren't expecting him to be here. And so then they talk to him, and she learns his story, and then she follows him home and gets even more of his story. And then that kind of takes her off onto something else. And so she's just kind of going through this whole thing. And it feels like she has a theme, and she's just kind of seeing where that takes her. And it's so interesting to see the way that is able to kind of, follow through all of these different people. She's so good at just striking up a conversation and, having this. she has such a personable personality to be able to pull all these people and get them interested in her project and get their thoughts on it and stuff like that, which I think is amazing as a fairly introverted person, because that's something that I would never dream of doing. And yet she's able to take all of these stories and put them together into this really great bigger story that all kind of still fits in with the gleaning thing and fits in with her own thoughts on her own life and the way that she's aging as this film and Faces Places, which is almost 20 years later, both kind of deal with that topic, and the way that she's able to glean things from her memories and her travels and stuff like that. It's just really, really well structured documentary.
Yeah, and you know what? You bring up a good point. She does just kind of follow the theme. This is very organic.
Yeah.
Incredibly organic. And I don't mean that ironically, because one of the themes is like about
produce,
ecology and produce and growing things. I mean, literally just organic, like finding an interesting thread of a story and then pulling on it and seeing where it goes. Tending the garden of a story and letting it grow and mature naturally and become really, really interesting. And you can tell she puts a massive amount of effort into this documentary. Mm-hmm. This is not like a short period of making this movie. It doesn't seem like, I mean, she not once but twice manages to find like in like these old storehouses, like pictures of gleaners. And I feel like, unless I'm really mistaken, those aren't super common, and probably took a lot of effort in order to find those. And both scenes of her finding them are included in the movie.
Yeah.
She goes all over the place and follows this plant to all of its natural ends and flowers at the tips of its stalks. And before this metaphor stops making sense completely, I'm just going to say it's an interesting way to construct a documentary, because most of the documentaries we covered are based on very specific events or very specific plot lines. Maybe the closest documentary in format to this one that we've covered so far in the podcast was Grey Gardens.
Yeah.
Which was like, hey, this is an interesting thing. Let's follow it and see what happens.
But even that was so contained. It was just them in their house. Like, that's all it was.
This one covers like the entirety of France.
Yeah. And various people, like interviews and all of these things. It's just amazing, the scope. And then I also love the way that she's, again, that personal aspect to her films makes it just fun to watch, and it makes her a part of the subject as much as all the people that she's filming. So she's able to do things like film the trucks on the highway, which really don't have that much to do with anything, but, you know, she kind of grabs them in her hand and stuff like that.
That was her gleaning of the trucks.
Yeah, or whenever she forgot to turn off the camera and she's just filming the lens cap as it's hanging down, and she puts it with some jazzy music, and she calls it the dance of the lens cap.
The 5-minute lens cap dance.
Yeah.
I love that.
But it's so much fun. And it's just like, again, this persona that Agnes Varda has kind of created for herself through her documentaries and stuff like that is, I don't want to say this in like kind of have a negative connotation to it, but she's kind of the fun grandma of film at this point in film history. And you get that vibe again in Faces Places, especially when she's contrasted against JR. But she owns it, and she loves that fun side of herself. She's like, oh, I messed up, but I really liked it, and I enjoyed it. And she has this fun view on things. Like, no filmmaker has ever accidentally left their camera on and thought, oh, I could call this the dance of the lens cap and have a lot of fun with it. Like, that is such a very unique aspect to Agnes Varda's personality, which is one of the reasons that these films are so interesting to watch. I mean, I was incredibly interested in the history and, the comparison to modern day gleaning in the various forms, whether that's literal gleaning, either, even oysters or potatoes or grapes or whatever. And then also kind of a slightly more metaphorical version where they're dumpster diving and stuff like that. But Agnes Varda's personality is what makes it go from a kind of intellectual kind of interesting to an enjoyable kind of watch.
Yeah. And I think this, out of all three of the movies that we've seen today, and actually all of the movies of Agnes Varda that I've seen, and I've watched the whole collection on Criterion Channel, which is only a fraction of her entire filmography.
Yeah,
but
this
still
one's
pretty
not
good.
even included, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. They're all owned by like these random like third-party distribution companies. Like all of the weird free trials I had to start on Amazon just to watch these movies.
Yeah, it's hard.
And I think out of all of those films, all of the Agnes Varda films that I've seen so far, this one more than anything shows off like her filmmaking chops.
Mm-hmm.
Or like her natural, just like, and I don't even want to say natural because that feels like it undermines like the effort she put into becoming this good. So it's definitely like a mix, but like her quality as a filmmaker in this movie shows better than any of the other ones.
Yeah.
Because this kind of gets into like just her, you're seeing all of her natural tics that make her a good filmmaker on display. Like always looking for a good visual, like she has 100% control of the camera because it's a video camcorder.
Yeah.
Finding interest in anything, being able to make anything fun, like the lens cap, being able to take advantage of a mistake. We've talked about that before on the podcast, how so many of the good things that have ever happened in cinema were just mistakes. But it happened and people ran with it. And that's not to say that the lens cap dance is the best thing that ever happened. I'm just saying it's one, and it is really good. But two, it's a good example of like that same like mental pattern of what happens in a good filmmaker's mind.
Yeah.
That happens. She has good instincts and a good eye, and a good personality for filmmaking. And they're all on full display in this movie, which is wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, those things that most filmmakers would call bloopers or would discard, she, puts to a use. And I think that's another thread in the film, is not only kind of gleaning things for their primary use, but also there's a thread of recycling. So like the people who kind of gleaned all the what are they called? Appliances off of the street and then fixed them or reused them, and someone made like a bunch of installations of refrigerators that they had done up as doll houses or various kinds of art exhibits, I guess, is another thing that kind of goes into it, which is really interesting. And yeah, you brought up like the way that this film shows off her abilities as a filmmaker. I thought, because I mentioned at the beginning that she's got this little camcorder that makes it all look like a home movie, but it still feels professional, in just kind of like the overall package and the grand scope of the whole thing. But I think that her origins as a photographer and her just innate kind of sense of composition and stuff like that still makes this a very visually interesting movie. So it's not painful to watch. There's a lot of kind of almost voyeuristic filmmaking and stuff like that at some points, but there are so many times when she creates these gorgeous compositions out in these grape fields, or with the artwork that she's filming and stuff like that, or just even at her own home with the things that she's picked up at the various shoots that went into making this film. She has that eye. She has this very artistic eye, regardless of what type of filmmaking tools that she's using.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. You can put her in any filmmaking arena. Well, I mean, I don't know if that's true, but you can put her in like any different filmmaking medium.
Yeah,
and she'll
there
be
you go.
Comfortable. In arena, I don't know. She never seemed to really gravitate towards the mainstream.
Yeah.
Her husband Jacques Demy did try for the mainstream at one point after the success of Young Girls at Rochefort, or was it Umbrellas of Cherbourg? Anyway, one of the two. And it didn't go super duper well, but I don't think she ever did.
Yeah, I can't think of it.
Also, interesting fact, Jonathan, did you know that Agnes Varda actually liked LA?
A little bit. I did watch her more autobiographical documentary that I guess we can plug, which is The Beaches of Agnes. And so she talks about kind of her fond memories of LA. She lived in several different areas.
Yeah. No, I just find it interesting because I do think she's one of the strongest examples about of like the more artistic indie filmmakers. And I know people like that or who want to be like that, who are like, I don't like LA. LA is so fake.
Yeah, she didn't really have resentment for LA.
Yeah, to have her go there and be like, there's just such an aura of storytelling about the city. And I love it. And I love the attitude about it. And I was like, oh, well, thank you for the validation, Agnes Varda. That was very nice.
And she loves interesting people. I feel like this is going to kind of go into Faces, Places in a second. But Agnes Varda seems to be the Humans of New York of wherever she was. She would just kind of find interesting people and film them and get their stories. And you definitely get that in The Gleaners and I, which each person that she films kind of had a tie-in to her general theme. But in Faces, Places, it feels very much like this thing that's kind of all over the internet right now, which is, just everyday people getting their stories told. And Agnes Varda was great at that, and LA is a great place for those kinds of stories.
She certainly knew how to seek out a good story. And on that perfect point, we're going to transition into what kind of feels like a very similar movie in certain ways.
Yeah.
But also isn't. And it also happens nearly 20 years after The Gleaners and I. Faces, Places from 2017. One of the last films from Agnes Varda. Jason, what is that one all about?
Faces, Places from 2017. Agnes Varda is now in her 80s, and she suspects the end is near. JR, a 33-year-old muralist, photographer, and artist, has been a fan of Varda's for nearly his whole life, and now the two team up to make a movie as they travel across France. They drive in JR's photo wagon, which acts both as a photo booth and as a functioning print shop. The two search for interesting stories in each village they stop in, finding interesting locations and people that go along with them, and taking pictures of the locals, pasting their murals across their homes and business. Most of the time making the locals ecstatic to have their stories blown up larger than life in the places they live. As the two travel, there are flashes back to Agnes's long and storied career and how it connects to the locations they visit, and a contrast shown between her age and JR's youth. As far apart as they are in age and experience, they are both artists, and they bond throughout their travels, and they grow from genius in the fan into two friends on the road together.
All right, Alex, so we go 17 years later, and we add a 33-year-old dude, photographer, into this whole mix of Agnes Varda's creativity, and we get this film, which almost feels like a BuzzFeed movie kind of thing, but it has like this a lot deeper kind of thing. I was thinking through the whole thing. It feels like almost a social experiment, but the fact that it's Agnes Varda and the fact that it has such a bent towards memory, and it actually has a strong element of gleaning to it, like we've been talking about, although they never actually call that out because they pull clips from all of her other films. They talk about the ways that JR was impacted by those, and just the ways that she remembers them, and she remembers different parts of her life is so interesting, and their dynamic is great because otherwise this would just be kind of like let's go do a bunch of art exhibits. But watching JR and Agnes Varda interact is so much fun that's really what you end up staying for.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very fun movie. I love that JR isn't technically a filmmaker.
Right.
He's a mural artist. He's very good at that. But he's not really a filmmaker. He's
an image maker.
So he's an image maker. This is definitely Agnes Varda's film. And two, I love that he grew up as an Agnes Varda fan.
Yeah.
Like he says he grew up watching Agnes Varda movies, which feels like a very French thing to do. Because I don't know a lot of American kids who see Agnes Varda while they're kids.
Right.
Like that's definitely something you've got to get old enough in America to do and feel interested in in films, and then go search for it to really happen. So I feel like that sets up for a very interesting dynamic. I love that they aren't like super close friends at the start of this movie, and it feels like they build up a friendship over the course of the movie.
Yeah.
That's really nice. And I like that there's like this weird slight vibe to the movie that's almost like a passing of the torch, but not really. But you can also tell that part of it is like Agnes Varda hanging out and working with and influencing the next generation of filmmakers, while she also actively talks in the movie about how she knows that she doesn't have a whole lot longer as a living person, and that her time is running out. So
it almost feels like a time capsule for Agnes Varda.
Yeah.
So the other element to this movie that I think we both picked up on is that even though this is, it is fairly organic, like The Gleaners, it's definitely more structured. It feels like they sat down. There's definitely a team going into this film. Not to say that Gleaners didn't, but it was a little more Agnes Varda solo driven. But Faces Places feels like there was a group of people. JR, he has a team, and Agnes Varda was working with her daughter also on this film. So it feels like there were some like, sit down, let's talk about kind of the general direction that we want this film to go, and then kind of follow that trajectory as we travel around to do these different art installments, which isn't bad. But again, it's like you said, they kind of have this trajectory, and over the course of this kind of adventure that they've created for themselves, they get to know each other more, and their relationship deepens. And they get to meet a bunch of other people, like I was talking about. There's just a lot of interesting stories, and they kind of they come up to someone, they find a big wall or some place that they would like to print something, and then they talk to either whoever owns that wall or the people that live around it, and they kind of find out what is the story of that place. And again, Faces Places. It's literally kind of connecting the people with the places that they live, or with the memories that they have. For example, the image that Agnes Varda had taken many years ago that they put on the side of this old German bunker that had fallen off of a cliff. And then, so that was kind of more of a memory thing for her. And that one was really interesting because it gets washed away that night as the tide comes in. But it's captured on this film. And also the cinematography feels a lot more kind of professional and polished in this film. And so it's a lot of fun, and the just getting to experience all of these different types of people across France is really interesting, even though it doesn't have quite the fluidity of storytelling that Gleaners did.
Yeah, it's definitely less organic than Gleaners. It's definitely much more of a structured, planned piece.
Not to say that they shut down opportunities along the way for surprises, but they had a little bit better of idea of where the starting and ending point of the film were going to be. For sure.
And they also, there is definitely a sort of like a natural gleaning aspect to it. And it's interesting. It's almost like Agnes Varda is like coaching JR on finding these people to glean, and being like, this is an interesting story to follow. Why don't we put this person up there? You can see them have creative discussions on screen, and it does feel like they click creatively over the course of the movie, which is quite nice.
Yeah, it was kind of fun. This one kind of, again, solidified that feeling of Agnes Varda being kind of the fun grandma of filmmaking, because JR is 33 and she's 88 or 89 during the filming of this. And they talk about their relationship. You know, it's a very kind of introspective film, as much of Agnes Varda's work is. So they talk about how JR is so good with old people, and one of my favorite parts is when Agnes Varda finds this wall that she really wants to use to print something on, and JR's whole team is just kind of laughing at her because they think it's the ugliest spot that they've ever seen. And she's like, "What? I like it. You wanted something with holes. I found one." And it's just like, you know, you can relate to that just like in experiences with older people and the way that they see things differently, not good or bad, but it was just like a really fun and genuine moment of them and their kind of different sensibilities. But for a lot of the film, it feels like they meshed and they kind of like had a singular vision. And the art that they create throughout the film is gorgeous and it's amazing. And it's all very temporary, but that's another part of the beauty of it. That's what JR says. He says that his trade is basically in temporary works, but through the film, all of those things are going to live on.
All right. So after this movie, Varda would go on to make a TV series documentary called Varda by Agnes. But other than that, this is the last movie that Agnes Varda ever made.
Yeah.
So how do you feel about this as almost like a goodbye note?
I was thinking about that because this is, I watched this and The Beaches of Agnes, which is, as I said, much more kind of autobiographical, more about her life. And I was interested in the fact that The Beaches of Agnes was released in 2007, 2008, and this is 10 years after that. So I think that for a while she had felt like her career and her life were winding down. And so she puts in those elements of, what it feels like to age, what it feels like to miss the people that you grew up with and that you lived the majority of your life with, even as early as Gleaners, like we said, in 2000. And Faces, Places, again, it feels like a time capsule for Agnes Varda because she's, again, looking back, she's going back and pulling like images that she took in college. And she's also kind of seeing the ways that the younger people are seeing the world and are seeing art and stuff like that. And she had been through and documented so much of the different cultural revolutions and stuff like that. That I think this is just a really interesting retrospective for her, and the ways that JR and the team, her team and her daughter and stuff, like really worked on showing things the way that Agnes Varda sees them and the ways that she sees people and art. And I think the most literal example of that is when they kind of fake this little eye test, and she's talking about the way that she's literally losing her vision, and so they try to make an image that looks the way that she sees and stuff like that. So I think that this is it's a really nice kind of I don't want to say like goodbye letter from her, but along those lines, it's not too much about her, but it has her sensibilities and her vision all the way throughout it.
It certainly is. It's kind of more of like a retrospective on her ability as a filmmaker.
Yeah, rather than like her literal life and stuff like that, like Beaches of Agnes
which might be more of like what Beaches of Agnes and Varda by Agnes is about.
Yeah.
So it kind of feels like a good closing note as far as like a filmmaker goes. Now, of course, it would be lovely if she was still around for another 10 years and could continue to make movies. But, the time runs out eventually.
Yeah, one of the other really amazing parts of this movie is the moment when they go meet JR's grandmother, who's 100 years old. And you're seeing Agnes Varda, who is 11 or 12 years younger than this woman, and they both have the same energy and the same kind of she didn't seem like this kind of 100-year-old vegetable or anything. Like, she was still coherent and lively, and it was amazing. And you kind of saw that, and it gives you hope for Agnes. And obviously now, as of a couple months ago, we know she didn't make it quite that far, but from this movie, you can see how full of life she was, even up to 2 years ago.
Yeah, certainly a very active human and filmmaker up to her final days, which is very nice to see. And it's nice to see her essentially, like, it's very clear that during this movie, like, obviously there's 1 or 2 points. There's a very dramatic bit at the end with Jean-Luc Godard that didn't seem very fun, but was very dramatic and interesting.
Yeah, that was interesting.
There was like a lot of fun had. This was a very fun trip, clearly, and a solid friendship was made through that trip.
So I have a question, Alex. What did you think about the little mystery element that they added to JR with the fact that he never takes off his glasses? And they kind of parallel that with Jean-Luc Godard, who also apparently never took off his glasses that often, but would for Agnes Varda. What did you think about that kind of like through line throughout the film? Did it feel?
I thought that was really interesting. It was one of the more organic pieces of the film, and it definitely felt like something that Varda came up with.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if it got close to the line of gimmicky, because the way that this film did feel a little bit more polished, it almost got to the point for me where it seemed staged to an extent.
Maybe a little bit, but I think that might be it just in comparison to the Gleaners.
Yeah, haven't watched those back to back.
Yeah, and I think because I got the same feel, but also like just compared to other documentaries I've seen and putting it into the vast context of filmmaking, this movie is still very organic. It definitely has a lot more polish on it. Has a lot more, obviously, technology had come along. Small cameras got a lot better. Cheap cameras got a lot better. There's clearly some money was put into this as well. It was a high quality made film with a lot of production value into the post, at least, put into it. So it definitely had a different feel than the Gleaners, but I do think it was still fairly organic. And I like that it was like this one bit of style that kind of came in at the end and reminded us that that the stories we were seeing, and all stories to a certain extent, are what we construct them to be. There are events that happen and facts that happen, but it's how we stitch them together that make them interesting and make them interesting stories. And that's very much what Varda and JR do in this movie to make it interesting. And that was one of the more interesting stylistic bits to me.
Yeah.
I found it very interesting. I thought it was a nice touch at the end. It kind of felt like a nice button on the arc of their friendship becoming. And I thought the fact that they kept it blurred when he took his glasses off was a very Varda thing to do. Now, of course, you could always just like Google JR's face and probably find it.
Yeah.
But, in the context of the movie, it was quite interesting.
And it had a really good thematic element too, because they talk about how that's part of his image. And, it's all about different people's faces and the way that they present themselves. And the places that they are. And JR is associated with his hat, his glasses, and his truck. That's his face and his place. So there was a nice kind of element to that too.
Yeah.
So with that, let's just kind of shift on into the overall note. Obviously, there's a lot of documentary work to talk about. And one of the things that we didn't bring up too much, but I always like to just kind of make a note of it when it happens, is the use of narration. And that's another thing that makes these films just kind of infused with Agnes Varda's personality, is the way that she narrates the Gleaners and Faces Places. And it's just a very personal type of filmmaking, and the way that she is, because narration can be used, again, like in They Shall Not Grow Old, and stuff like that, to just kind of lay out the facts. And that was laying out the facts from a subjective point of view, or it could be done like a PBS documentary where it's historians kind of just explaining stuff on an intellectual level. But the way that Agnes Varda uses it, like we mentioned in Gleaners, where she calls things like the lens cap dance, or she talks about the way that she likes to capture the trucks in her hand. Like, it's just all these little quirks that come through pretty much only through the narration. I don't think that there's another way to get that personal with a film of this type.
Yeah, you make a good point. And it kind of goes back to, her whole style being organic, but certainly constructed. she lets her garden grow, but then trims it to be exactly what she wants it to be, rather than those 60s documentaries that you mentioned way back in the earlier part of the podcast, Jonathan, which are very fly on the wall.
Yeah.
Just kind of let things happen. And then instead of putting voice in through narration, put all of the voice in through cutting and deciding what would be shown and what wouldn't be shown. Whereas Varda takes more direct ownership of her role as the storyteller and doesn't just cut, but also adds her own voice in and is like, yes, I am definitely telling a very subjective story right now about this, this, and this.
Yeah, and even in one of the other documentaries that we looked at in our documentary episode, Grizzly Man, Werner Herzog puts himself into the storytelling, and he uses a personal first-person type of narration, but it still feels distanced. It feels like he is talking about these people who are separate from himself, and he thinks that their story is interesting, so he's going to talk to them for us and kind of figure it out. But Agnes Varda, she narrates her quirks, and then she goes up and she talks to the people, and she gets to know them, and she follows them home, and, she doesn't care what stage of life or what kind of life that they have. She's just interested in who they are as people and kind of getting their stories told. And it's really eye-opening, especially Gleaners, when you're seeing all the different ways that these people live, and then Faces Places, which has a different scope of showing the way that people live and the places that they live. But yeah, that narration that is her almost like a diary entry of like, this is what I was thinking as we were making this movie, is a really unique use of that.
Yeah, it definitely has a touch of a very, very personal touch to it. A very, very, I don't want to say intimate, but kind of like a sort of like kind, gentle nature to exploring these people whose story she's gleaning.
Yeah.
And kind of very, it's a very feminine touch. It really, really is.
Yeah.
And kind of like the classic idea of femininity, which isn't to be boxed into it. But again, it's probably another good example of somebody who's a breakout, maybe one of the top ever, if not the top ever female filmmakers so far. In all of film history. It's a very good example of what one could consider as feminine filmmaking. This kind of more empathetic approach to it, and I've noticed that a lot all throughout all of these different female filmmakers that we've been exploring, both on the show in our own independent stories. Dorothy Arzner from the 1930s has a lot of good movies out there that have the same kind of similar feel and contrast that you're pointing out there, Jonathan, between like Agnes Varda and Werner Herzog in terms of amount of like level of empathy put into it. Not to say, and I think that's really a strength of the filmmaking too.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a weakness of it at all. I think it's something that makes these documentaries that are very much consciously going for a subjective viewpoint even stronger is when they treat their subject, regardless of who they are, with care. And we do know that it's not like a compulsion. It's a conscious choice of Varda to do that when she does it. It's a power in her ability and within her control, because taking a look at Les Bonheur, she completely eviscerates this guy, basically, over the course of her filmmaking. Not that guy deserves any empathy. I really don't think he does. But we do know that she has both the power in her wheelhouse to be incredibly soft and caring towards the people in her movies, and incredibly hard and like satirically hand out like the satiric condemnation, which in the case of Les Bonheur is certainly deserved.
Yeah, and I think that just kind of goes into the overall aspect of her as a filmmaker, is that she is so introspective and she's so thoughtful and smart in the way that she makes her movies. Like she, can go into a film with like I am going to make this point about the way that people are that I don't like, and I'm going to do it in the most biting way possible in Le Bonheur. Or, I have an idea. I really like this idea of gleaning. Let's just see where it takes me. And then once she has all this material, she's able to construct this film that has so many layers and stuff to it. And the same thing with Faces, Places. She's just... Everything that she makes, you can tell, has a lot of thought put into it. And it's not just kind of like slapped together to be fun and entertaining. It all has another dimension underneath to it that is both personal, but it's very, again, well thought out and intentional, which is what we're always looking for in good directors. Good directing is intentional directing, which is, I think, a point that we try to get to in almost every one of our director episodes.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I think I almost want to revise something I said earlier about Agnes Varda being one of the top female directors of all time. I think she's just one of the top directors of all time. She's really, really good.
Yeah.
She just is kind of, I think, through a mix of, one, being French, and therefore being outside of the mainstream in Hollywood. Two, making a lot of documentary-based movies and, very indie-flavored movies. And three, if we're being completely honest, being a prominent female filmmaker has not been something that Hollywood has considered in vogue in their marketing for the past, up until very, very recently. Certainly not for the large part of Agnes Varda's career. So she's kind of existed out of the mainstream. And I think she's a name that comes up in film history classes a lot. But I think she is a name that deserves a lot more study from people who are aspiring filmmakers.
Yeah.
I was a lot more than are traditionally given.
After I watched The Gleaners and I took an entire documentary studies class in college, and I was like, why did we not study this movie? It's geniusly constructed on pretty much every level. I was just kind of shocked because I was like, this is so well done. Why did I never even heard of it until we started looking into Agnes Varda a couple years ago, and then more in depth for this episode. But yeah, she's really good. And I think the other thing that goes into her story that's so interesting is just her history. And we didn't talk too much about her films from the French New Wave era. We talked about one a while ago, and then Le Bonheur. But, her connection with that movement and her connection with all the people, being married to Jacques Demy, her friendship with Jean-Luc Godard, and all of that whole, era and place of filmmaking makes her a director that has influence throughout the rest of film history, whether anyone knows it or not. Because like we talked about with the French New Wave had a huge influence on the American New Wave, which I think filmmakers nowadays are having this nostalgia for and kind of trying to get back to that kind of storytelling. And so all of these techniques that were being innovated by all of these people, including Agnes Varda, continue to live on in a way that we've talked about many times on the podcast, where images get recycled, and then those influence the new generation of filmmakers. And whether the filmmakers know that they're pulling these influences through this long line of history, they really are. And a lot of that starts in the French New Wave and Agnes Varda.
Yeah, Jonathan. Viva Varda.
Viva la Varda.
That was her slogan. You can probably still buy a button or a t-shirt that says that.
Oh, I'm sure. But I mean, that brings us into what we're going to be talking about next week. I don't think did we plan this this ordering?
Nope. This was just lucky.
This just happened.
Worked out well.
But we talk about the American New Wave a lot on the podcast, and so we thought that we should actually do an episode on it. And because it's a big milestone in Hollywood filmmaking that transitions from the studio system into bringing about indie filmmaking and the different types of filmmaking that we have nowadays, apart from the Hays Code. So we're going to get into all of that history next time on the podcast. And what films are we going to be tracking throughout that time period, Alex?
Well, first up, we're going to be talking about Bonnie and Clyde from 1967.
Huge milestone.
Which is pretty much the start of the American New Wave, and also the end of
studio
various
system.
things. Obviously, there was an official end of the Hays Code. We'll talk about that next week. But this is like, if you're looking at just movie releases as marking stones, this is the end of the Hays Code.
Yeah.
This is the end of the studio system. This is the end of the golden era. And this thing that people built up to be at the time, I think we have a slightly more nuanced view on it now, but at the time, what was viewed as the evil empire of the late studio system collapsing and being replaced by chaos. And the movies of that time certainly reflect a lot of that chaos and dark tones, including Bonnie and Clyde, which we'll get into, which is currently available on Netflix for those of you already with Netflix subscriptions, which I'm assuming is all of you. We will also be talking about The French Connection from 1971. Fun fact, before you watch that movie, that car chase was done without permission, and a lot of people were almost killed during it, so enjoy watching that. And then finally, from pretty much the end of the American New Wave, before we get into the full-on Hollywood blockbuster era that is still currently kind of sputtering along, is The Deer Hunter from 1978, featuring a lot of big American New Wave stars, including Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken, Meryl Streep, and some other people whose names I'm forgetting. But those are the three we'll be covering. And of course, there's lots more out there that we'll probably mention. But those are the main three we'll be focusing on.
Yeah, so before we sign off, let's talk about the ways that you can support us. As we mention all the time, we have a Patreon and a Ko-fi account. So our latest Patreon podcast was about Oscar Michaud, where we debunked ourselves on air. We thought that a fun fact was true, and it was not. So you can go check that out for $5 a month on the Patreon account. And our latest Patreon commentary track, as we plugged endlessly last time, is the Lord of the Rings Extended Edition complete set of commentaries, which anyone can get if they donate either one Ko-fi on our Ko-fi account or subscribe to any tier of the Patreon. So if you are as big a fan of Lord of the Rings as I am, and you want to see all the facts that I got wrong throughout that commentary track, go subscribe on Patreon. And also, if you want to subscribe for $1 a month on Patreon, you will be able to participate in a poll that will be coming up in a couple weeks, maybe about a month. So if you would like to decide what film remakes we'll be talking about, you can subscribe on Patreon and then keep a lookout for that poll.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And I'm at the Blue Jay 1994.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
So
it almost feels like a time capsule for Agnes Varda.
Yeah, it does. It does. It definitely does.
What is that?
But whoever is in the room next door and has been there for a few days laughs like a freaking maniac.
Okay.
I don't know what's going on over there.
I can hear them through your phone. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, typically it doesn't go on for very long.
Okay.
But it is unfortunate when it happens. What? What are they laughing at?
You think they're watching Charlie Chaplin two-reelers?
Probably not. Nobody laughs like that at Charlie Chaplin two-reelers.
Bet they did in the 20s.
They probably did.